Hey, everybody, welcome to tomorrow's headlines. Today, the much anticipated returning guest, Gary Wayne, is here today. We had a lot of people immediately asking for part two, and that's good because I have enough questions for part two by the end of part one. So, and I'm pretty sure he has a lot of the answers. Either way, we will have a very great dialogue. So, I will roll the intro and then I will bring Gary in here. All right, so we're here. Give it welcome. How's it going today?
Going very well, and thank you for inviting me back, and very happy to be back and to continue our conversation that we had a few months ago, and hopefully the audience will appreciate some of the things that we're going to get into, because I think between your depth of knowledge and my depth of knowledge, we kind of get into areas that most people don't.
That is what actually several comments I got was usually when people are interviewing Gary, they seem to get lost with the amount of knowledge he has, and you kept up with him. And I'm like, actually, I'm just trying to listen to what he's saying. And I don't know. But it's true. You do have a very extensive depth of knowledge, and that's what I like. I like to have people who have looked at both sides of the coin and talk to them and get an in-depth look at what we're talking about versus, well, this is the doctrine that I'm taught and this is what I'm sticking to. And then, so anyway, that I see you as that.
Yeah, it's frustrating if you're a contrarian like you or I are, or a Berean like, as we were talking about just before the show, because I think it's wrong. I wish we could just accept what we're told at times, but as the Bereans tested Paul, which was so terrific, is they verified everything he was saying was based out of the Old Testament for whatever he was teaching for the New Testament, and they did not let him off the hook for that. And that's probably one of the best testimonies for Paul's Gospels, is the test of the Bereans. And so if they would have found any sort of glitches in there, they would have certainly held him accountable for that. And I think we have to do that with our church as well, and particularly when we get into preconceived, superficial notions of prehistory and preconceived conclusions for prophecy.
Right. And that's 100% true, because I've gone through and just the way I read the Bible is I like to look at it not from a lens of I'm trying to prove my point, but from a lens of I want the truth regardless of what my opinion is. And that's where you find the real meat and potatoes, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think once you get onto that approach, it's actually freedom, because you're not bought into something that you're trying to necessarily defend. You're trying to sort of reconcile the information. So when I went from, and I, as I came back, I read everything with a new sort of lens and trying to verify things for myself. So I wasn't initially sort of trapped into those preconceived conclusions. But once I figured out that this is a process on your learning curve, so adapt an approach and an understanding that permits you to adapt to passages that you found that were inconvenient, to say the least, to a lot of sometimes of what we thought we knew, and find a way that has to fit in without manipulating the Bible. And once you figure that out, everything sort of works out. But if you struggle with that, then you're fighting against Scripture, which you shouldn't be doing. You should be looking to see how it fits in. And if you do see something that is out of place, that you think is out of place, or out of place with your thoughts, then that's a red flag for you to say, I need to dig into this deeper.
Mm-hmm. Get into that uncomfortable. It's like when people ask you a question about something and they bring up this one verse. Yep. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but every now and then someone will bring up that one verse. Well, what about this verse? And I'm like, I hate that one. I really need to figure that out, but I'm going to figure out how that works in there. But
Yeah, because it just makes your understanding more. And once you understand what the enemy is using to divide us, find out that they've manipulated it, and they've left out other context and passages, and now you find that you have a better understanding of that narrative and other things that it might lead into, and you start to develop a skill set on how to handle people who are manipulating the Bible, or people that are trying to lead you away from God by finding faith issues and saying you can't rely on the Bible because it's in contradiction, or that doesn't make any sense, or whatever the rationale is.
All right. Good. All right. So I have, you're aware of the Zuzim and the
Yeah.
Izis and that tribe of the Rephaim, right? Okay. I have a question for you. I was reading it through Daniel 8:5 when I was listening to your book and going through listening to the different tribes, and I heard the mention of the Zuzites is what it says in English, but it's the Hazuzim in Hebrew, right?
Yep.
Okay. So I found something that was interesting in Daniel 8:5 in the Hebrew, where it actually seems to specifically mention the Zuzim, or a tribe, and it's in the dream or vision that Daniel has when it says in Hebrew it says Mebin vahine Safir ha-izim Bamin Hama Arab, coming from the west, coming from the Arab, which is interesting.
Yes.
That word right there is the word it translates as goat, but can you tell me about the Ha'azim, the Aziz, or whatever it is? I know I know some of what you were talking about in your book, but I want to know the depth of what you've heard, and if somehow this correlates to returning Rephaim tribes
Yeah.
in the end of days.
I think there's a connection that's in there to start with your end point there, and that word Arab is generally, as it's defined, as kind of as a mixed blood, or a scioning of bloodlines, or a mixing of some sort. And that also in Daniel 8, you have Antichrist as the little horn associated with satyr gods as well, and also being called stout, and other words that are associated with sort of the giant sort of understanding. So now when we look at the Zamzuzim, or the Zuzim, and if I didn't cover this in the last show, if wonder why I'm using Zuzim instead of Zuzite, is that I use I am for the male plural for giant tribes,
Right.
pureblood giant tribes, and that's an ancient term that was also used in other cultures to represent a majestic royal bloodline coming from the fallen angels. So you would have cherubim, seraphim, ophanim for the Hebrew names that are provided for some of the angelic order. And so that's one of the distinctions. So if I'm into a hybrid human tribe, I'm going to use ite, or if a pure human tribe, I'm going to do ite as I do the pronunciation. So yeah, so we have two distinct groups of these Zamzuzim. And what's interesting in Genesis 14 is that it says the Zuzim from Ham. Well, these are east of the Jordan River, not in Egypt. Ham is the land of Africa, or at least North Africa, and that's not where these ones are located. And so then you get another tribe in Deuteronomy 2 that's called Zamzuzim. And so, but these are different Hebrew words, but there seems to be kind of a connection there. So I speculate sometimes whether or not, when they're fighting the Zuzim from Ham, does that mean they also went into Egypt as well? We don't get any more detail on that, but one might sort of infer that that's the case. Or there's two different branches of these tribes west of the Jordan River, one that's more to the north and one's a little bit further to the south. So in book 2, I give a few examples of that. And these would be the ones that are associated with Egypt or Ham would be the Sati, as they're understood in Egyptian mythology and for giants. So, okay, so how does that sort of all sort of connect then back to, giants in the end time? Well, we're going to have a giant relationship with the end time. It's going to be like the days of Noah, and I'm not just sort of speculating when I say that. So, in Revelation 9, for example, you have the release of the pit prison. And so whatever's in there is coming out, led by Abaddon or Apollyon. And in Ezekiel 32, we have this passage of the terrible ones that are locked in the sides of the pit prison, and these are the mighty ones, or the Gibborim, who did terrible things while they were on earth and were killed and were sent as a demon spirit to the sides of the pit. And there's also in there the strong ones, which is the Hebrew word El for the fallen angels that are in there. So you got two different groups in there. So at least from a Revelation 9 perspective, we have a relationship with the end time, and possibly even Antichrist, who's also known as the son of perdition and the one who comes up out of the pit prison, the one who once was, now is not, but will be again. There's a relationship there that we should probably kind of explore. So now if we look at Daniel 2, in 243, we have either literal giants or the descendants of the giants who are going to mix their seed with humankind. You can't really interpret that any other way, except for maybe from the Hebrew, you might infer a possession of demon spirits onto these 10 kings of the end time. That would give them additional sort of power. So we have that passage we have to deal with. We also have Psalms 21, 8 through 10, where in the time of God's wrath and the time of his vengeance and fire, he's going to remove their seed they're going to remove the fruit of these ones from the seed of humankind. So there's a separation there. And the terrible ones are described in Isaiah 25 as being killed or finally destroyed completely from the face of the earth on a mountain in the end time. And they're called the branch of the terrible ones. So we have all of these sort of passages that are implying we're going to have a connection with giants in the end time. So if you move in now to Joel 1 and 2, or Ezekiel 39, you have the mighty ones and the bulls of Bashan in Ezekiel 39 with the mighty ones, the Gibborim, that are going to be slaughtered. And the bulls of Bashan is a reference to gods of the Ugaritic texts, as we get the most closest sort of a association with the Hebrew language and the Bible with the Baalim Council. And also their offspring, the Rephaim tribe, are also called bulls. So when we see Jesus being mocked on the cross, you have the bulls of Bashan that are mocking him in the book of Psalms. So that could be referring to one or both, right? Because these are demon spirits and angelic spirits not in the pit prison if they're at the crucifixion and witnessing it. So we have interesting passages in Revelation 6, 16, 19, and I think 18 as well, where we have these great and mighty men along with the kings, right? So the kings, that goes back to a Greek word for king, but I won't focus on that one so much. But understand that the kings are royales, but the greater family are the nobility. They are the Indo-Aryan word or Indo-European or giant word for nobility, or noble ones, right? That's the definition. And so when we understand that these are bloodlines that are going to be there, we also need to account that there might be possible a return of giants or a recreation of giants, or it's just the bloodlines. There's could be all of the possibilities or only one. But the word that's used to describe these great and mighty men in the book of Revelation are two Hebrew words. One is megas and megastranes, and they're kind of part of the same series of words, which are the Greek words coming out of their ancient language to describe things greater than the normal size, greater in stature, greater in everything. and typically used to describe giants. So when we look at the application of these great and mighty men, these are the ones that have been ruling our world in the top two classes ever since. So we have them showing up at the beginning of Revelation. They control all of the oligarchical corporations for the end time. They're going to control the priest class. They control the education class. It's the same system. And I think those are the direct connections that we have for Antichrist and for bloodlines of the giants that are going to show up after the flood. And when now you're talking about that Arab word again of being mixed, well, I think that might be sort of a representation of the dilution of those bloodlines, just as you might imagine that great and mega statue in Daniel 2 having starting in gold and degrading in its purity of metal or value of its metal down to iron and clay for the last one, which is completely mixed. So I think the language is consistent there.
Right. I've looked at that in Daniel chapter 2 so many times, and I'm like, oh, the 10 toes, that's the 10 kings. All right, that makes sense. And the mixing of everything, because it says that they take the women or they cleave unto each other, whatever it is, but they don't get married. Whatever, I forget the exact phraseology there, but I also find that interesting because in another scripture it says that we bring women to the Antichrist for whatever his nefarious purpose is. It seems to me, right now, let's just go a little far right, right-wing conspiracy fringe topic here. When I think of the, I have a feeling that a lot of these creatures or beings are going to show up. Some of it's they're going to say, "Oh, we're already here. We've been here. We're just interdimensional. We exist on the same in a different realm or whatever." That, there's a lot of scientific research, study, patents out there that show that we have the technology that we receive from these creatures that even have the same names. Some of them say they have the same names as the angels in the books of Enoch. Especially Semyaza seems to like to come up an awful lot, So we have all of that. And I found several patents on the inertial mass reduction engines that we own, the Navy requesting to build ships with inertial mass reduction, and then all of it kind of culminating to the fact that it's all extraterrestrial, quote unquote, technology, which is actually one of the questions I wanted to get into. But what I have noticed is they talk about these beings, and they say they have this ancient language and this ancient writing that looks like hieroglyphics, or it looks like some sort of, they don't say Proto-Semitic, but they say, some sort of old Middle Eastern language or something like that. And one of the things that they do is I found a random rabbit hole where this person was talking about how they've been working on these bodies and they've been studying their DNA, and he's some sort of biologist of some sort. And he said when he studied the DNA, and this can't be verified, so this is just for all intents and purposes entertainment, right? He said when he studied the DNA of these beings that they've recovered from some of these crashes, that their DNA is a mix of different species from this biome, from Earth's biome, of bees, reptiles, lizards, human. And he said the DNA was like it was copy pasted. It was in such a precise pattern, and it was so perfectly concise and identical in each of the beings that it had to be something that was created, not something that was natural, because there would be deviations and defects and stuff. Some of these things really resemble the hieroglyphs and stuff that seems to kind of tie into there. And so I was listening to your book. I like to listen while I research and pray in tongues. And I noticed that you mentioned multiple times, and this is Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2 for those of you who are, and I would recommend go get it from his website. Get yourself an autographed copy. All right. I know for us, getting a book from our website benefits us a little more than getting it on Amazon. Amazon gets like 70 some odd % of what you get. And so Just putting that out there for you. Genesis6conspiracy.com, I believe, is the website. You can correct me. But anyway, you were talking about how there seemed to be almost like a diminishing return in their ability to reproduce. So, could you elaborate on that a little bit? You don't have to incorporate aliens or anything. That was just my little whirlwind rabbit hole there. So,
Yeah. Well, I think the alien mythos is directly connected to the angelic rebellion, fallen angels, and various offspring, spurious offspring that they created. And there's a hierarchy of those beings. And we get terms that sort of come out of prehistory, like chimera, that they use for DNA manipulation to this day. And I think that we're getting our knowledge from the angels as angelic technology today. Maybe it's coming through the demonic presence, but it's still angelic technology to bring us up to the same level of technology that was before the flood. And so I would suggest that there are many kinds of beings. And if they wanted to continue to produce, they had to do things after the flood versus before the flood, which seems to have had less restrictions on them. For example, Nephilim seemed to be able to produce in great numbers, no issues. They had no need to reproduce with humans. They probably did. We get a few accounts around the world where they did, but it wasn't sort of a necessity. But after the flood, they have a fertility issue of some sort. I tend to speculate in book one and try and back it up with examples, which I do, that it's more of a female issue of reproduction, which is why they have to intermarry with humans to create the hybrid humans and giants versus humans and angels that produce the giants. So you create sort of this lower level of giant, these hybrid giants, right? And that they have to continue to introduce human blood in that matter of preventing themselves from going extinct or creating blood diseases like Habsburg jaw disease or hemophiliac diseases or all the other diseases associated with too close of intermarriage. Within 4 generations, they try and keep at least 4 generations apart to prevent those blood diseases from coming in. So when we look at the technology that they have, they could do before the flood if they had access to all of the angelic technology, or the angels did something on their own to create these ones that they've been trying to duplicate with less efficiency ever since, or you get the Xeroxing effect that you can't continue to create these clone bodies over time. We get an example that's interesting out of Greek mythology with the centaurs. And I cover this off in book one, where these are some sort of hybrid chimera type of animal that are associated with giants. In fact, many of them were teaching wisdom to the giants in Greek mythology. But these are created a little bit different from the goddess Hera, somehow in a cloud off the earth and in a different way than, let's say, Zeus would have sexual relationships with Alcmene to create Hercules, for example, right? Pretty straightforward. This is implying something different, and something different comes out. So it implies that they had that sort of technology that they're trying to duplicate with the Chimera projects to this day. So I think that probably has a shelf life. So I think what happens after the flood is there's restrictions that are put on, and they may even be running short of those options as to regenerating those DNAs and whatever that they've been doing through clones or however the process is. And we're also told in the Bible that there are those in this world that enslave us. And it's a very odd word in Galatians, which is elemental. And then in Colossians, same types of beings are also enslaving us in this world. And in both passages, we're talking about an association with fallen angels and worship of fallen angels. In elementals is the Greek word stoichion, and it can mean the basic element of the world, which is an inanimate object, but the basic element. Or it can mean these beings which aren't inanimate, because inanimate objects can't enslave us. They have to be animated or some sort of life form, and they're part of this hierarchy called the elementals. And so rudiments is the word that it's translated into the KJV in Colossians 2, but it goes back to Stoichian as well. And where elements are being used for the basic elements of the world, it's quite obvious in the context of the first and the passage that it's different than these two passages. Elementals are the bottom of the order of the alien mythos. They're the lowest level, and there's 4 groups associated with elements: fire, wind, earth, the 4 elements. And there's 4 groups of elementals. 3 of them are smaller beings, and a being that is also larger than humans. And reptilian are called salamanders. So the 3 groups of the smaller ones, and these salamander ones tend to live in the earth for the most part. So again, with that mythos of these reptilians larger than humans that are living in caves or in the earth. Right. The other ones are like fairies. So you have 3 groups of the fairies. You have good-looking ones, you've got mischievous ones, and you've got ugly ones in the 3 groups. And there's one group in the ugly group called the gnomes. They have high-level technology with UAPs or UFOs that come through portals or fairy domens, and they kidnap people, do sexual experimentation on them. And their description of what they do when they kidnap people and do sexual experimentations on them, or their looks, are identical to the Greys in the alien mythos, and they're actually called the Grey Gnomes, and the Grey Neighbors and other words sort of associated with that. So, and then of course these beings, they're trying to regenerate their DNA by doing these sexual experiments or taking DNA to paste into theirs or however they do it. So, but they have a large level of technology. So, and then they have a different sort of language. Now, in the demonic aspect, if you're dealing with an exorcism, or if you're taking ancient sort of accounts of the language that the giants spoke, they spoke as in a mumbler, or as in very quickly gibberish. And what's interesting about gibberish is it follows the word giant in the Webster's dictionary.
Yeah, and Gabor.
And Gabor seems to be the source for it, just as you dig into it a little bit deeper. And this is the Indo-Aryan language that we know as Pi. When you see the original etymological source, it'll say Pi, it means Proto-Indo-European. And that was the language of the giants. So when you look at words like Megastranes, it's going to go back to the Indo-European word Meg, M-E-G. And that's the source word for Megastranes that's used to describe these great and mighty men in the end time. So that's the language of the Philistines that was lost, because they brought that language from Crete. And they used to use a cuneiform-like style of writing. And so when we look at all the things that you're talking about, I see a common line that goes right back to these giants as part of our early history, dominating the history and setting the course for our history.
Right. You know what really ties into that is actually I do have a list of things written down that I wanted to talk about, and we're just naturally and organically getting into that conversation. So that's great. So one of the things I wanted to ask about was about the dolmens, but I have another question that just popped into my head. Okay, so a while ago I was looking into something. The American Stonehenge, L.A. Marzulli, or Henge rather, L.A. Marzulli talks about it, and they had this the person who wrote the book America BC, I think, I forget what his name was, but he wrote that book, and he said he found an inscription inside that that was Iberian cuneiform. Yeah. So I looked at that inscription that I found that he had written there, and to me, to be honest, it looked more like Carian. Now, I know we have the Carians mentioned in the Old Testament. At one point, they were hired to work in the temple. And I was like, wait a second. I felt like, and I could be wrong. There's not a whole lot known about the Carians. Um, they claim that Iberian wasn't translated back then, so there's no way he could have translated it and all this stuff. And yet, he seems to have done a pretty well job at that. Have you found in your research anything pertaining to the Carians? And the reason that I ask is because, originally they're from Greece. And to me, looking at that, or from the area of Greece or Turkey, looking at that, I was thinking, are they part of the Canaanite tribes? Is that something that you've come across?
No, I've not done any research on the Carians, but they certainly come out of, as you read that sort of biblically, out of a context of a period of giants and hybrid giants. And where did they come from and what was their language? Well, if we look at the Indo-Aryan groups, the Indo-European groups, there's 5 different groups, and they populated all of the lands that the people that Babel migrated to, including into Iberia. So the original Iberians are giants. They're Indo-European.
Of course.
If you look at into Greek, the Scythians or the Tuatha De Danann, they're the Proto-Greeks, right? And they intermarry with them. The Etruscans are the Proto-Romans. And so you get a merging of those cultures, but typically it's the giant Indo-Aryan language that at least in the beginning dominates, and the religion continues to dominate. So those languages become very closely related. Hittites would be a classic example of that, who were thought for many centuries not to be a legitimate tribe of Canaan, but were Indo-Aryans. That's because they intermarried with dark-haired Indo-Aryan groups, like the Hurrians or the Hurim, and produced the Mitanni dynasty. And the Hittites are associated through intermarriage and conquering of those regions and groups, and so their gods are associated with the giants, and the language is more Indo-Aryan because it becomes the dominant language. I would make, just where I would start my research from, if I were to research the Carians, I would be looking at it in that sort of consistency of what happened in prehistory.
Yeah, that's good. So I believe the Carians came about before the Iberians, but I did a little. I'll have to maybe send you the research at some point to show you where my brain was going with this. But the Carian appear to have come before the Iberian, because apparently the Iberian Peninsula language, it showed up later than the Carian language, but the alphabet, you can see, has derived from some sort of Proto-Canaanite, maybe even Proto-Semitic alphabet. So when I look at it, you can see the letters are very similar, and then there's just minor details that you would see how letters kind of change over the course of years. And the Iberian were known as being sailors and traders, etc. And the Carian were warriors and revered sailors. Also, they're said to derive from the Minos Greek.
Right.
Is there any sort of I think that just means king, right? But is there
Minos was a king,
right?
Right, and he's a king of Crete and the associated sort of islands from where the Philistines come from, and the origination of the Cherithim and the Pelathim and the Chaldean giants. So if they're connected back to that puts them still into that dark-haired Indo-Aryan variety, which the Iberians are. They're known as Celts, but Celts have their connection back to the giants as well, right? So they're branch people. So does it make sense that you would have maybe the Iberian Peninsula there, or the Iberian part of Spain being settled at a later date with slightly evolved but the same written language, essentially, an oral language or similar one. Later, sure, that would make some sense. Absolutely.
This is just a little rabbit trail. So all right. That's this is the kind of stuff that I think about in my brain. So I love to have the chance to talk to people about that. And one of the things that I've noticed is there was a migratory process. It seems to me, it's very clearly evident when you do the history that there seemed to have been a migratory process where the after the time of the flood, that people seem to have migrated. The giants specifically seem to have migrated across the ocean to what we know as the American continent, South America, North America, whatever they called it back then. And they, L.A. Marzulli did the DNA testing on the skulls that he found in, was it Caracas,
Yep.
Peru? And they discovered that the DNA from that was actually Middle Eastern with red hair.
Yeah.
And how does that fit into the any particular tribes of giants that you're aware of that were described as being tall, red-haired, white uh, giants? Because they're always referred to, it seems, in the Native American lore as the white giants with red hair that ate people.
Yeah, so there's a lot of tribes, and I name a lot of different tribes in book 2. That a lot of ones that people aren't familiar with, but you can
Mm-hmm.
basically break it down into 3 groups of colors of hair, if you want to put it that way. You've got blonde hair, you've got red hair, and you've got dark hair. We already talked about the Hittites being part of more the Aryan line that's associated with the Achaemenid dynasty of Aryan bloodline that comes from Greece as well. And then you have Tuatha De Danann, which had both, right? The tribes of Danu,
Mm-hmm.
or the assembly of Datanu in the Ugaritic text. So Horim is the best clearly identifiable ones in the Bible, as you take that word back and their descriptions and relief images
Mm-hmm.
throughout the Middle East and their ancient descriptions. They were red hair and pale skinned.
Yes.
And so, and generally that's going to come with, hazel eyes, but they could have had blue eyes as well.
Right.
Anakim, for example, would have been more of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed variety. And Amorites, who are a hybrid branch, would have probably come from one of the blonde-haired groups, like the Anakim, which were the Amorites lived readily amongst, were were blonde-haired. But the Rephaim, the original Rephaim, also seemed to be red-haired.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the red hair that they're talking about with the giants is a little bit different than the red hair that we have, that we see today. You have,
Mm-hmm.
a darker red, and you have a strawberry blonde hair. I believe it was more into the strawberry blonde variety,
Mm-hmm.
which they prize in the bloodlines more than the darker red color. And then the blonde was more, not necessarily a blonde, but more of a whitier type of color of hair.
Mm-hmm.
So like when you look at that series House of Dragon, I think that's kind of what they're trying to get to, almost like an albino type of hair, right? No matter what your skin color was. And so, yeah, I would go Rephaim and Horim, and the other ones get a lot more difficult to try and figure out what their hair color was.
That makes sense. So in 2022, I did an interview with L.A. Marzulli, and I brought that up also. And I was like, what's interesting? And I didn't know this about the red-haired Horim. So when you brought that up, and at that time I called them Horites because that's just
Yep.
the easier thing. I said, what's interesting is they had their eyes were 33% larger of what he found, and their foramen magnum was pushed a different spot in their brain. And I said, what's interesting about that is, well, granted, it would show that they would have a long neck. I wouldn't be surprised if they shared characteristics because they all seem to have derived from, a similar root, not all necessarily the same exact root, but something similar. And the Horim or Horites were known as essentially cave dwellers or troglodytes. And
Yep.
that was one of the speculations of that. And then So it's interesting that you say that, because that's where what I had drawn that conclusion without the just based off of the Strong's Concordance. So having that extra little bit of information really kind of drives that home.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and interesting what you're talking about the eyes as well. So 33% larger, maybe even more as you get back to the more pure. And as they're sort of shown in prehistory, wrap around to the temple part to a certain degree. That's not artistic license. That's what they're describing, because they were called the shining ones throughout many cultures because their eyes would light up a whole room. Now, if you don't have those larger eyes and you don't have that wider sort of wraparound, you wouldn't light up the whole room. You might light up what's in front of you, but the wraparound gets it to, at least, 180 degrees in front of you in terms of lighting up that room.
mm,
And yeah, when you look at that cranium, you have a significantly larger cranium. So if you look at King Akhenaten, who is over 1,000 years after the flood, he is very much one of those transitions in with the dilution of the bloodline. He has this huge skull that's usually covered with a hat, but you're going to see some of the uh, sculptures and things that they used on reliefs to describe them. You're going to see this big elongated skull. They're sutureless, which is another thing, even with the
mhm.
crew skulls or the North American skulls. So one thing you can't do with binding of a baby at birth is increase its volume capacity. You can make
Right,
it longer to emulate the gods, but you can't increase the capacity.
right,
So those two things are non-human. They are giant-like. They are larger and different from the original sort of nature that they might be related to. And so, yeah, when I look at red-haired giants that are talked about in North America, these are going to be very much akin to the ones that were discovered in Peru. Maybe at a later date, maybe at an earlier date, doesn't really matter, but there's a migration that comes with the giants spreading around the world. And you get a migration also that could be working in behind it, that with the knowledge of the giants, particularly again with the Hittites and um, their sister branches of the north, that would be, the Phoenician Empire. They were doing trade all around the world,
right.
and we're not generally provided a link of how did they know to go there and to discover certain things like tin or copper or whatever they were looking for to bring back. I think they're making contact with their more purebred relatives that have already gone there, and they knew where they went. So as hybrids, they were sort of in the loop, and they were making use of that inside information.
Right, and we see that evidenced very clearly in the Egyptian hieroglyphs, where they have hieroglyphs of corn that looks specifically like
Yeah.
shucked corn, and meant the mention of chocolate, and just things that they didn't have, quote unquote, access to, or they
Yep.
didn't have that kind of trade system back then. And I'm like, it's interesting how they believe the cavemen, 20,000 years ago, could have just crossed over the Bering Strait, and people could have taken boats to the Polynesian islands, but all of a sudden, for a few thousand years, everybody forgot how to travel.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the nonsense that we get taught to fill in the gaps, just is astounding when you actually put on your critical lens and start looking at things and asking questions. Yeah, they never stand up to critical analysis, and that would be one classic example. Like, how did the cavemen have more knowledge and more navigation capabilities
They're still
than that
making
what came
stone
later?
rocks, but they can navigate the across the world. Well, looking at the stars, okay.
Yes.
That's just the way it is. So let's see here. All right, so the Dolom, I have some questions I wanted to know, because in an email you had sent me, and you mentioned the Dolomites and the Rephaim and part of the ability to use the Doloms, or Doloms, right? To travel interdimensionally. Dolmens, that's the one. To travel interdimensionally or enter into hell or the underworld or whatever. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Save me a few hours of research.
One of the standard doctrines in polytheism is interdimensional travel to specifically one dimension, and that's known biblically as Hades or Sheol. It's known as the other world, Argatha, 1,000 different names around the world. But it's a standard sort of doctrine. And so at the foot of Mount Hermon is the gateway to Hades, the cave to Hades, right? And that's where Baal and the Ugaritic texts would go back and forth every day from where their heaven is, where their gods are located in Hades, Sheol, but separate from where the pit prison is also located in the earth, but in another dimension. And even the giants in the Ugaritic texts had the ability to go back and forth. So they either had interdimensional sort of bodies, but what is more likely, they had interdimensional technology to permit them to go through. And so these are understood in the fairy mythos as domens. And if you Google the word domen, Dolmen, you're going to see these things are all over the world, and they're like a mini Stonehenge. So you have two rocks like this and then a capstone. And so when you look at sites like in England with the what's the name of those big pillars in Wales, that's in a circle? Stonehenge, yeah. Those are all thought to be all domens, all portals, and multiple portals that would be located there. And in Gilgal Rephaim, on the Golan Heights at the foot of Mount Hermon in Bashan, you have this ancient site that's in the circle as well. And archaeologists say there's hundreds of domens that were located there. And it's all part of their religion and their belief system. So they believe you can go interdimensionally. So when we were talking about the gnomes, they would go through what they call a fairy domen, right? A fairy portal, because domen means portal. And yeah, so when I look at things from a UFO mythos perspective, I'm looking interdimensionally, not intergalactic, because prehistory tells us all about interdimensional travel, but not intergalactic travel. So I tend to look more from that sort of perspective. And so the home of the gods is where the royals and the giants wanted to get to. So when they died, they would learn all of these rituals to navigate their way to go to be with the gods and to be like gods in their heaven, which is in the earth. And so when we look at this location, understand that when they do a lot of their imagery, like the world trees, whether it's the evergreen tree or an ash, elm, or oak tree, its roots go into the earth. So from a genealogical tree perspective, that's taking their roots back to specific celestial mafia godfathers. From a organizational structure of the thelemic tree of the secret societies, the Cedar of Lebanon, those roots go back into Hades as well, and that's where they receive their authority from. And so they display this type of belief system in everything they do and everything they write about, right? It's just sort of part of it all the time. And so we should be aware that the Bible does talk about Sheol and Hades in the New Testament, and that the pit prison is located. Now, these gods seemingly don't have access to open up the pit prison that's in the same location, but a different spot of Sheol or Hades. But it is a different sort of dimension. And so when we look at Revelation 9 being opened up, that's talking about an interdimensional removal of these beings that are in the pit prison that are coming into the physical world. And so I think we should be very much aware of this understanding. And biblically, we're provided examples um, of how to understand that in a monotheist lens.
Okay, so that makes sense because immediately one of the things I wrote about in my book was about upcoming interdimensional travel of being released. Of course, it's already happening now. I'm not fooled by the shroud that they're trying. Everyone's like, "Oh, that's not real. That's fake. That's just science fiction." I'm like, literally, just go Google the patents on these things. Look up inertial mass reduction and Navy, and find the naval request where they literally asked to build ships that use inertial mass reduction for their unconventional spacecraft that they want to use for war, to be ahead of. It's part of what Donald Trump's talking about when he says we have technology beyond what anybody can imagine. But we go to Amos chapter 9. I actually pulled it up here, just right here to Amos 9:2. I'll read it in English, not in the nearly inspired version. Let's do the New King James here. It says, though they dig into hell, from there my hand will shake them. Though they climb up to heaven, from there I will bring them down. And then verse 3 says, though they hide themselves on the top of Carmel, there I will hunt them down and seize them. Though they hide from my eyes at the bottom of the sea, there I will command the serpent to bite them. And what I thought was interesting about that is if we go into the Hebrew here in 9:2, where it says, though they dig into hell, it uses the word yateru. And when you click on it, the first thing that comes up is it says to force or to make a passage. So to force yourself. So in a sense, what it's saying, though they force themselves or make their own passage into hell, and that kind of ties in directly with what Jesus said. Anyone who comes into the sheepfold through me is mine, and I'm paraphrasing. But anybody who does not come into the sheepfold through me is a liar and a thief, and gives me the idea between these two scriptures. And in my brain, I have all of the in between, so I can jump from A to B. That interdimensional travel is something that God's already been aware of, and that they're already doing. Because how could you force your own way into hell? And so this is supposed, and then it says if you make your way into the heavens, because it's not the word heaven, it's the word Hashemayim, the heavens. So if the heavens is and Sheol, if that that just, and then Carmel. All right, I'm going 1,001 places. Let me hear your take on that.
Well, we know there's interdimensions. We know heaven is defined as three locations, Shemayim, as you said, in the plural, and that there's a place where God lives in another dimension. It's somewhere that we don't have access to, but they're going to want to storm that, and they do in the end time again, just as Satan did in Isaiah 14 in prehistory with the angelic rebellion. They're going to do that again, not successfully, but they're going to do it again. So there has to be an ability to do interdimensional kind of travel with that sort of implication. Coming out of the pit prison into the earth from another dimension is another interdimensional sort of understanding that this event is going to be so fearful and frightening, you wouldn't want to be here for it, and the things that those creatures are going to do to the people who don't have a seal of God on them. And so Shemayim can mean where God lives in the spirit realm resides, the habitation for the spirit beings in the first heaven. You also have what's inside the firmament, and the firmament's called heaven when the waters were separated, and then what's on the other side of the firmament, three locations of heaven, a little bit different than the seven heavens that are talked about in polytheism, but you get those other ones described within the Bible within seemingly the second heaven or outside the firmament. There's these portals or doorways of these great things like hailstones and fire and water that can come out of those locations. So just again, the nuanced difference between the polytheist understanding and how the Bible sort of describes it, if people are trying to make sense of the different descriptions of that. So yeah, Shamayim is also, you could also translate that as heavenly ones, as in the angelic ones from um, the interdimensional sort of aspect of it. So I think we have to be aware of interdimensions, because Revelation 12 has the storming of heaven in the end time. Uh, Daniel 8:10, Antichrist is actually going to throw some of the starry host down to the earth and trample on them. And so when we look at Daniel 8:10, that's at the same time as Revelation 12. It's at the midpoint of the last 7 years. And that's when Antichrist comes to power. So they're going to have interdimensional angelic technology that is going to be able to force their way into heaven. Some people might even use that to say that that falling star that opens up the uh, pit prison is busting into that um, in the end time. Certainly they'll try and do it before, but they can't. I still kind of lean that all the angels that are talked about in Revelation that are doing or permitting things to happen come from the throne of God. So I'm not convinced it's a fallen angel that opens up the pit prison. I think it happens through a loyal angel, but that's my leaning in terms of trying to understand that. I've looked at it on both sides. At some point in time, you kind of want to make a decision. So that's where I lean to. But we have to be aware that we have spiritual beings as the invisible ones, and we have the visible ones. And when Alice Bailey talks about the externalization of the hierarchy, we need to understand that that starts in 2025, according to them. I'm not saying we should use their chronology, but they're trying to make the invisible ones visible again, so that it's going to be like the days of Noah, when giants and fallen angels walked amongst us. And where are they going to come from? Well, they're going to lie to us. They're not going to tell us it's interdimensional. They're going to tell us it's intergalactic. So we fall into the preparation propaganda that they've been providing all through my lifetime, and even before that. So yeah, I would look at that ability to storm into heaven is something all the Antichrist wannabes have wanted to do. And when we hear about Nimrod, whether it's in the book of Yasher or it's a Josephus accounts or in non sort of biblical type of writings, he used to do hubris speeches at the building of the Tower of Babel and saying, if God gets out of line again, I'm going to go into heaven through the building of this tower and kill God if he gets out of line. Well, that's what an antichrist wants to do. Now, he's not permitted to do it, and there'd be no need to tear down this ziggurat if it wasn't more than just a ziggurat. And what's interesting in the Akkadian version of the Tower of Babel, of the Eridu account with Enmer-Akar, which is, I think, a polytheist accounting of Nimrod, and the name in the vowelless Hebrew or Semitic is actually in there with Enmer-Akar. But it's in the Akkadian version, it's Babalu is Bab meaning a gateway or a portal, and ILU is transliteration of EL for an angel or a god. So the understanding there would be from how they would look at it, not as confusion of languages, but he had created a technology or was about to implement a technology that could go interdimensionally, which means he could go into the pit prison, release the gods that he was worshiping and all the terrible ones that are in there, or into heaven and storm heaven like Satan did. And so he wouldn't be looked at as such a madman in that sort of situation, because you can't build mud bricks even past the firmament led into another dimension. But now it starts to make some sense.
Right. And then now we have this new stuff coming out about the pyramids. I'm going there. And how they're what, 2 miles deep or something like that. And then the speculation is that the Tower of Babel was approximately 2 miles high or something like that. I'm like, that would have been some feat. What if it got buried? I'm not saying it is. I'm not sold that it is. It just happens to be very interesting that, I think brought this up in our last interview that, we see the face of the Sphinx on Mars. Now, all of a sudden that's pareidolia. I'm like, okay, maybe it is. Oh, now they found, pyramidal shapes up there and waterways. And I found a CIA documentation where they remote viewed Mars in the past and saw that there were giants there and they lived underground and they built pyramids and stuff. I'm like, why would they have any reason to say they were building pyramids there? And it just so happens, they're cousins, Mizraim or not, maybe their cousins, uncle, nephew. I don't remember exactly what it is, but come on.
Yeah, it makes no sense that you would drop things that are convenient to the propaganda that is being provided to us. Just doesn't make any sense. And if you're remote viewing, you're probably having some sort of vision done by a demon or a fallen angel to lie to you about things, because that's what they do. So, but those things are key to their history and their belief system. So from that standpoint, it would be in there, and that they would know people would just lap it up because they've been trained not to do any sort of critical analyses. People think that, you go to university to learn how to think. They've taught people how not to think and just to accept the propaganda. So,
Right.
and
You're
when we look
taught
at
what to think.
yes, and never to question. You can question everybody else and every other belief system, but you do not question our theology. So, and believe me, philosophy is the love of Sophia, the love of the mother goddess, the mother goddess of wisdom. So, you're learning polytheism, you're honoring the pantheon of gods and everything that they do on a university campus. And I'm not saying knowledge is bad. I'm not. It's how it's used that counts. But what they're doing is not pure teaching of knowledge. They're brainwashing people there. So now what's interesting about the pyramid is that in that when that discussion about Nimrod and building the Tower of Babel, he gets this knowledge from, in the Polychronicon and History of Freemasonry, he gets it from a fellow called Hermes, who finds one of the pillars of Lamech or Enoch, because there's two accounts of it, and goes to the Great Pyramid and finds this knowledge hidden underneath the Great Pyramid and takes it back to Nimrod, who uses that knowledge to initiate 1,000 Masons in their accounting to build Babel City and Babel Tower. So from a polytheist consistency aspect, not only would you have a library, vaults of knowledge, of the ancient knowledge there, but also maybe one of the more important technological centers that was preserved, that they knew would survive the flood, underneath as well. I think the coincidence of that is hard to overlook, especially when we look at how they've been slowly weaning us onto what's at the pyramid. And over decades, we've been taught with their propaganda and brainwashing through teaching, entertainment, you name it, that these were likely more than just a pyramid. Now, 1,000 different speculations as to what they were, but the standard one that's most common is these were put on locations that had natural energy sources through what they call ley lines around the world, and that these were some sort of technology that could produce energy and other things. And typically going to interdimension was part of that whole understanding. So who knows what I'm waiting to see what they actually release as to what's underneath, as to all the speculation that's coming out, before I get too far ahead of that. But it's consistent with what they're going to release to us in the end time to overturn every preconceived notion.
And that makes sense, because right now, for us to do any kind of interdimensional travel, they're all about frequencies and vibration and all that stuff with the New Age teaching. So they know how to do that in the natural. They've been studying that for the scientific aspect of it for years. But in order to be able to do that kind of stuff, it requires an immense amount of energy that perhaps existed before the flood. I think, I've heard studies. I think Chuck Missler maybe was talking about how the gravitational force on the world shifted after the flood or something like that. So it would make sense that they would have that technology there, and that it would be an energy source of some sort, because in order to get into the heavens, you have to have a very powerful electromagnetic or electrogravitic device of some sort that would be able to produce that. And so if it was something stationary, you would think that, the ley lines specific. I know about that because of before I was a Christian, a history with witchcraft, and that those were used for traveling, so to speak. When you're astral projecting, you follow the ley lines. I don't remember them being called ley lines, but I understood that when I heard it. And you follow those to get from point A to point B, and they're the ancient spiritual trails or paths or whatever. So in order to access that, you'd have to have a stationary point A and point B that would be interconnected, I would imagine, in order to go from point A to point B, because essentially a lot of the stuff is like they have these craft that I have some of the documentation from it somewhere in some file somewhere. They have this very advanced artificial intelligence, and what they do is they insert the destination they want to go to into the AI to cause it to think where it wants to go, and it thinks and then travels through that thought in that outside of the third dimension, and I think outside of the fourth dimension, which is time and space, into what they consider the fifth dimension that they call eternity in the gateway process procedure. So I would imagine that would be that would somehow tie in there with all of that, and how, because I know in the spiritual realm, when you think where you want to go, you go there like that. So
Sure. And if you look at ancient sites that are similar all around the world, one of the common legacies are pyramids. So if now you're using a physically created technology in the physical world versus having the spiritual ability to just make it happen, like God would do, or Jesus would do, or the Holy Spirit would do, then you would have to have a point of starting and a point of ending. And it has to be done within the laws of the physical world, which they can do. What they can't do is what God does.
Right.
He does things outside the laws of physics, but it's a counterfeiting of what they can do to make them look like they're the equal of God's. And all of it is, again, consistent with their sort of belief system. So, I mean, I don't know what all the deceptions are going to do, and I don't think we can fully imagine it, but certainly looking to prehistory and what they believe, they're going to bring those same ideas back. They're going to be dressed up a little bit differently to suit our technological nature, but it's what will be again, and nothing is new as under the sun. So expect it to be, very much similar.
Yeah. All right. We've gone into some crazy directions all over the place. This is what I like, though. You don't know where we're gonna go, but it's gonna be full of stuff that people are gonna be hanging on, salivating. Like, what are you gonna say next? But is there anything that you want to talk about before we wrap it up?
No, I think we've covered some interesting sort of connections about prehistory and prophecy, and that would be what I would encourage everybody to do is to learn about prehistory, to try and help understand prophecy. And I would certainly encourage people to not accept the standard dogma on prophecy. They're all working from preconceived conclusions. And if you're tired of dealing with inconvenient passages that they don't answer or you can't answer, you should maybe change your approach. And I think standard dogma is the easy way out, but it doesn't stand up to standard It doesn't stand up to biblical research, and particularly on the prophetic side. And the first red flag has to be on end time prophecy is you have all of these formalized approaches, and they're all different. How can that be? And they're all basing it on scripture. So that sounds like an elaborate plan of, misinformation and disinformation that continually sort of gets repeated to confuse people so that you don't dig into it. And some of the commonalities of it for people is to look for the red flags. If they can't answer the inconvenient passages and make it fit, or they have to tell you that it doesn't say what it actually says when you can read it for yourself, something's wrong with that. People who want to define what Jesus said by what other prophets said, that's a red flag. Define all of the prophets by what Jesus said, but everything around what Jesus said in his chronology, everything starts to fit. And if you can do what Robin does, take things back to the Greek and the Hebrew to get the fuller context of the word. You can verify why there might be slightly different translations of the Bible as well in doing that. And I would encourage people also to use Bible Hub. If you just want to put up one verse, do Bible Hub in the verse, you're going to get over 20 different translations. So you can look for the consistencies that are there in the English as well. And I would also, really encourage people to learn more about prophecy as we move forward, but learn it for yourself and understand it's always a learning curve. And so if you look at the chronology that Jesus provides in Matthew 24, here's my advice, if I can just sort of continue on this, is use Matthew 24 as the template. And it's in chronological order because you get the word tota used for the word then. It means the same thing in English as it does in Greek in that application. These are sequential events that are divided in the middle part by the abomination. So you get the 3.5 years before and the 3.5 years after, once you move into beyond the start of the sorrows, but you actually get into the affliction, which is tribulation, thlipses. And so once you've sort of used that as your template, now go into Mark 13, Luke 17 and 21, put the additional details onto the Matthew template. So you don't have to duplicate everything. It's very similar, except that you're going to get additional details. Like, for example, in Mark 13, you're going to get the elect are taken to heaven, that you would add that taken to heaven to the Matthew 24 passage that doesn't say taken into heaven, just gathered from around the earth by the angels. So those additional details, just overlay that on. Then follow Jesus' instructions. Go to the book of Daniel and overlay the Daniel prophecies around that template. And you may not be able to get them all to fit, but you will as you go on this. So you got Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 11, which is really important. So start with Daniel 9 with the last week and the midpoint of the abomination, and then go to Daniel 11, and from about verse 20, you're going to have the rise of Antichrist to the abomination in the last 3.5 years. So now you've got those put in place, and you can put in Daniel 12 after that. Then go to the testimony of Jesus, which is the book of Revelation given to the angel to show John, and take Revelation 6 to Revelation 14 about 7 to just after the angel preaches the last of the gospel. Overlay that onto the first 3.5. You get the summary of sequence of major events in the last 3.5 years in the balance of Revelation 14. Put that in, then you can put all the other details in coming out of Revelation. And all of a sudden, now you've got this master template that you can add any New Testament prophecies in there and all Old Testaments onto it, and you never get a conflict. It just fits. So if you're tired of conflicts, start with Jesus and understand that this was made for us to understand. You don't have to be adept of the mysteries You don't have to twist scripture like a pretzel to make it make sense.
Hmm.
And then however you come to your conclusions after that, make your conclusions. But I think it sort of, when you start it's like building a jigsaw puzzle. Once you have the template, you just start filling in the pieces. They just go in perfectly.
Great. That is very, very good. That's everything. Like, everything's based off of scripture, and it will always come back to Jesus. Like, there's no way around it. When I'm doing research and stuff, I'll read Old Testament this, Old Testament that, and it comes back to Jesus. Like, everything in the New Testament, everything that Jesus said, you can literally trace it back to the Old Testament. And like, it'll pop up and someone will say, well, okay, then where's that in the Old Testament? The New Testament to me is a reiteration of the Old Testament. And so I'll just be like, okay, well, let me just, I don't know if people are just too lazy, or maybe it just doesn't click in their head. And I'm not trying to be, offend people here. But when someone says, well, where's that in the Old Testament? My first thought is, let me Google it and I'll find it. But
Yeah.
I would encourage you to do the same thing yourself. Instead of asking me, where's that in the Bible?
Yeah.
Google it. Do some research, because you're going to learn so much. I was talking to you before we started this interview, and I said it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, and it's the glory of kings to seek a matter out. And we're royalty. We're adopted into sonship with Jesus Christ. We're royal priests. So we reveal the glory of God that he's concealed just for us when we dig into the truth. So if you really want more glory and a greater understanding of his glory, dig into the truth.
Yeah. And two other things. One is, if you understand that the Old Testament is talking about the pre-existent Jesus all the time, and that the word logos of the God Theos is the cognate Greek term for Jehovah of the Elohim, Lord God. The Lord, that Jehovah of the Elohim, the word of God. That's who they're talking about. So the interaction in Old Testament prophecy is with the Lord. It's Jehovah. And all of a sudden now you can look at the Old Testament in those same sort of eyes as how the Jewish people would have looked at it. And if you do one more thing, is do not confuse Old Testament prophecy attributed to the tribes of Israel, or to northern Israel, which is Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Those are for them. That's why we have the New Testament prophecies for the church prophecies, but don't conflate them. And understand that the end time is the completion of the Old Testament prophecies in the last 7 years in the fig tree generation. So it's a lot of work, but it's not complicated.
That's good. All right, we have your information scrolling across the screen here. That's Gary Wayne, Genesis6conspiracy.com. The only place you can get his book. I'm just kidding. You can get it on Amazon also. Is there any other information that you would like to share for them to reach you or anything?
You can follow me on Facebook under Gary Wayne. I have a timeline. I post a lot of my shows there, also into the Gary Wayne and the Genesis 6 Conspiracy group. I am listed as an admin. I didn't create the group. I only participate in the group. So keep that in mind. And I don't have time to administer the group. So I leave that up to the administrators. I'm also on X as well, at Gary Wayne. So you'll see my picture come up if you Google that on Twitter, and I post shows on there as well. So you can ask me questions on my timeline, Messenger, in the group, or send me an email if you want to get some information.
Yeah, and let me tell you something. He gives you information, and I encourage you to take time to dig into that information, because it's not just, you got to understand, when you're in ministry, you're doing what we're doing, what he's doing. He does more interviews like all the time, booked out for months, So for him to take the time to respond back, and first of all, count it as an honor, and secondly, as he has decided in his heart that you are worth taking time to respond to. So I would just ask you to take that time and into consideration, and research and look into what he shares with you. All right. Well, I hope that was honoring to you and everybody.
Well, it was. Thank you.
I'm very glad that you're here. It's always a fun time. An hour and 20 minutes went by like that. It's unbelievable. So thanks everybody for coming. We love you guys. Be blessed. And I will see you probably tomorrow. Until next time. Bye.